Little girl reached out to Hell's Angels biker for help. What happened next will leave you in tears. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. The wind had picked up as Jake drove through the snowy streets, his mind racing with thoughts of the little girl behind him. Emily's presence, fragile and vulnerable, had stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. The city was quiet, the snow falling in thick layers, and all Jake could think about was getting her to safety. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching her small form, wrapped tightly in the blanket, huddling close to his back. Her hands were still gripping him, her tiny fingers trembling against the leather of his jacket. "Where do you live, Emily?" Jake asked, his voice softer than he intended. "I don't know," she replied, her voice small and barely audible over the sound of the engine. "I was walking, and then I just couldn't find my way back." Jake's heart ached as he heard the fear in her voice. He knew all too well what it was like to feel lost. Not physically lost, but lost in a world that didn't seem to care. It was a feeling he had buried deep inside for years, something he had never shared with anyone. "It's okay," Jake said, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out." He glanced around, trying to think of where they could go. There was a small diner up ahead, the neon sign flickering through the snow. He pulled into the parking lot, the tires crunching over the ice and snow. "Let's stop here for a bit," Jake suggested. He turned off the engine and helped Emily off the bike. She was still shivering, but her eyes were starting to look a little more alert. Jake walked her inside, the warm air of the diner hitting them as the door swung open. The waitress looked up from behind the counter, her eyes widening when she saw the little girl. "Oh my God, is she okay?" she asked, standing up. Jake nodded. "She's cold, but she'll be all right. She got lost." The waitress, whose name tag read Betty, rushed over with a cup of hot chocolate. "Here, sweetie. Drink this," she said softly, handing the steaming cup to Emily. The little girl took it hesitantly, wrapping her small hands around the mug, savoring the warmth. Jake watched them for a moment, his mind still racing. He couldn't help but think of his own past, of the people he had left behind, and of the cold, empty nights he had spent alone. But now, with Emily by his side, there was a different kind of responsibility weighing on him. He wasn't sure how long it had been since he had cared about anyone this much. But in that moment, as he watched her sip the hot chocolate, he realized that he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't leave her like this. "Thank you," Emily said, her voice small but sincere. Jake nodded, his throat tightening. "You're welcome, kid." Betty set down a plate of pancakes in front of Emily. "Eat up, honey. You need your strength." Emily smiled faintly, her hands still shaking as she picked up her fork. Jake took a seat at the counter, his eyes scanning the diner. It was small, cozy, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the air. He had been in places like this before, but never with someone who needed him. Not like this. "You're not from around here, are you?" Betty asked, breaking the silence. "No," Jake replied, his voice low. "I'm just passing through." Betty gave him a knowing look, then nodded. "Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. This town's small, but we look out for each other." Jake glanced over at Emily, who was finishing her pancakes. She didn't look as frightened as she had when they first met. There was a calmness in her now, a sense of safety that Jake hadn't realized he'd been offering. "Thanks," Jake said, his voice softer now. "I appreciate it." As Emily finished her meal, Jake felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. It wasn't just about protecting her anymore. It was about giving her something he never had, a chance to feel safe, to feel like she mattered. After all, he had never really known what that was like. Emily was the first person to make him feel like he could still be someone worth caring about. He stood up from the counter, ready to leave. But as he looked at Emily, he knew there was more to this than just helping her get through one night. This was only the beginning. Jake didn't know where their journey would take them, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her face the world alone. The next morning, Jake woke up to the soft sound of rain tapping against the windows. The weather had turned even colder overnight, the snow now mixing with the rain in a constant drizzle. He stretched, the weight of the night before still heavy on his shoulders. Emily was still sleeping on the couch, wrapped in the blanket he had given her. Her small form was curled up, peaceful for the first time since he had met her. Jake made his way to the small kitchen area in the corner of the room, the old coffee pot already brewing a fresh batch. He poured himself a cup, the warmth from the mug seeping into his hands as he leaned against the counter. His thoughts drifted back to his past, to the road he had been on before Emily had shown up in his life. It was a road full of mistakes, filled with choices that had led him to this moment. He had spent years running from the ghosts of his past, never allowing himself to get too close to anyone, too afraid of being hurt. But now, with Emily in his life, something had changed. He felt a connection to her, a bond that was impossible to ignore. The door creaked open, and Jake turned to see Emily standing in the doorway, her small feet bare against the cold floor. She had the same look on her face as she did the night before, vulnerable, yet strong. "Good morning," Jake said, his voice softer than he intended. Emily smiled shyly, her eyes still a little tired. "Morning," she replied. She walked over to the table, sitting down with her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I'm sorry I kept you up last night," she said quietly. Jake shook his head. "You didn't keep me up," he said. "You're safe now. That's all. That matters." Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "Where are we going now?" she asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. Jake sighed, setting his coffee down on the counter. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But we'll figure it out." He looked over at her, noticing the way she held herself, like she was trying to be brave, but there was still a hint of fear in her eyes. "Hey, you don't have to worry," Jake continued. "You're not alone anymore." Emily's face softened as she looked up at him. "You really mean that?" she asked, her voice small. "Yeah," Jake said, nodding. "I do." The moment lingered between them, the weight of their shared experience heavy in the air. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt like he was actually needed, like he had a purpose beyond just surviving. And that feeling, as unfamiliar as it was, felt good. After a few moments, Jake stood up. "Let's get you some breakfast," he said. "We can figure out the rest later." Emily smiled, and for the first time, it was a real smile, a smile that reached her eyes. "Thanks," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. Jake didn't have all the answers, and he certainly didn't have a plan. But in that moment, he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let anything happen to her. He was going to protect her, no matter what. They spent the next few hours in quiet conversation, Emily telling Jake about her life, her family, and what had happened before she ended up on that road. Jake listened, offering what little comfort he could. He wasn't a counselor, he wasn't a savior, but he was there. That, he hoped, would be enough. As the morning turned into afternoon, Jake felt a sense of urgency settle in. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that someone would come looking for Emily. And while he didn't know who she was running from, he had a feeling that they wouldn't stop until they found her. He grabbed his jacket and slid it on, then turned to Emily. "We need to go," he said. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "Where?" she asked. Jake didn't have a solid answer. "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere where no one will find us." He grabbed his keys and headed toward the door. Emily stood up, following him. She was still hesitant, but there was a new determination in her steps. She trusted him, and for the first time in his life, Jake realized he might be able to give her the one thing he had never truly been able to give anyone else: protection. As they stepped out into the cold, Jake felt the weight of the road ahead of them. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be obstacles, dangers, and challenges they hadn't even begun to imagine. But as long as Emily was with him, he knew he wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, but the cold still clung to the air as Jake and Emily drove through the winding roads of the small town. Jake's thoughts were a mix of uncertainty and determination. He hadn't planned on getting this involved, but the bond between him and Emily had grown in such a short amount of time that it felt impossible to walk away now. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching Emily's reflection as she stared out the window. Her face was still pale, but there was a quiet strength about her now, something different than when he had first met her. "How are you holding up?" Jake asked, his voice low but caring. Emily turned her head slightly, offering a small smile. "I'm okay," she said, though her voice was tinged with exhaustion. "It's just, everything is so different now. I don't know what to do." Jake nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "You don't have to know everything right now. We'll figure it out. One step at a time. They rode in silence for a few minutes, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the occasional distant thunder rolling in the background. Jake wasn't sure where they were headed, but he knew they needed to keep moving. Stopping for too long was too risky. They passed through the quiet streets of the town, the houses barely visible through the misty fog. It was a place that seemed frozen in time, the kind of town where nothing much happened, but everything could change in an instant. Jake took a left turn down a narrow road, the tires crunching over the gravel as he slowed the bike. He spotted a small motel. Up ahead, the neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. It was the kind of place that wouldn't ask too many questions, just what they needed. He pulled into the parking lot and parked the bike, motioning for Emily to stay close. As they walked toward the motel's entrance, Jake's eyes scanned their surroundings. It wasn't that he expected danger, but he'd learned long ago that it was always best to be prepared. The old man behind the counter greeted them with a nod as they walked in. He didn't say much, just handed Jake a key to a small room in the back. "It's quiet here," the man said, his voice gravelly, as though he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "Room 12. You'll be left alone." Jake thanked him and led Emily to the room, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. Inside, the room was small but cozy, with a single bed covered in a faded quilt. The walls were lined with old wood paneling, and the small window offered a view of the parking lot. Emily immediately went over to the bed, sitting down with a sigh. Jake closed the door behind them and locked it, taking a moment to scan the room once more. He had learned to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that they weren't out of danger yet. "You should get some rest," Jake said, his voice gentle as he sat down at the small table by the window. Emily nodded, but there was a look of hesitation in her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with uncertainty. Jake leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the window. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But we're safe for now. That's all we can do." Emily laid down on the bed, pulling the quilt up to her chin as she closed her eyes. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She was still scared, still uncertain about the future, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. Jake watched her for a moment, his mind still running through all the possibilities. He had never been a hero. He wasn't the kind of guy who expected people to thank him. But something about Emily made him want to be better, to do more. He knew that he couldn't protect her forever, but for now, he could give her something she needed most, safety. He stood up and walked over to the door, glancing out the window one last time before pulling the curtains shut. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of the woods yet. But for the moment, they had time. And time was something they needed to make the next move. As the hours passed, the rain continued to fall, a quiet, steady rhythm against the windows. Emily slept soundly, her breathing steady and peaceful. Jake stayed awake, his mind alert and his senses on high. He knew that sooner or later, they would have to move again. But for now, he allowed himself to relax, just a little. In the back of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder what the future held for them. What would happen when the world found out that Emily had escaped? He couldn't let her go back to whatever life she was running from. But he also couldn't protect her forever. As much as he wanted to, he knew that there were things beyond his control. For now, though, Jake was willing to face whatever came their way. With Emily by his side, he felt like he could take on anything. He sat down at the table, the quiet ticking of the clock the only sound in the room, and waited. The following morning, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the air heavy with humidity. The town, still hidden beneath a thick fog, felt almost like a ghost town. Jake had been awake for hours, staring out the small motel window, watching the mist swirl around the streets. His mind was racing, but he forced himself to focus on one thing at a time. Emily was still asleep, curled up on the bed, looking peaceful for the first time in days. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get complicated. He couldn't stay in this small town forever. Emily couldn't keep hiding from whoever she was running from. But for now, he had to protect her, even if he didn't know exactly how. He walked over to the window and looked out, scanning the empty parking lot. His instincts told him to move quickly, to get out before things got worse. But how could he just leave her here? He had promised to keep her safe. "Jake!" Emily's small voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see her sitting up on the bed, rubbing her eyes. She still looked tired, but there was a new sense of determination in her expression. She had been through so much, but she wasn't giving up. Not yet. "Morning," Jake said, offering her a soft smile. "How are you feeling?" Emily stretched slowly, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Better," she said, though the uncertainty in her voice was still there. "I'm just not sure what to do next." Jake walked over to the bed and sat beside her, his expression serious. "We're going to figure it out," he said, his voice calm but firm. "One step at a time." Emily nodded, but there was a lingering doubt in her eyes. "But where do we go now?" she asked. "We can't stay here forever." Jake hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew they couldn't stay in this motel forever. They needed to get somewhere safer, somewhere they wouldn't be found. He couldn't protect her forever, but he could try. "I know a place," he said, his voice low. "It's not far from here. We'll lay low for a while, figure out our next move." Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "What place?" she asked. Jake stood up and grabbed his jacket, slipping it on. "It's a cabin," he said. "My old man's place. It's isolated. No one will find us there." He paused, glancing back at her. "It's not perfect, but it's safe. We can figure out what to do next once we get there." Emily didn't say anything at first. She just stared at him, her face unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "Okay," she said quietly. Jake walked over to the small table by the door and grabbed his keys. "We leave now," he said. Emily stood up, still a little hesitant, but she followed him to the door. Jake opened it, and the cold air hit them both like a wave. It was a stark reminder that they were still in danger, still on the run. But for now, they had each other. And that was enough. They made their way out of the motel, into Jake's bike. As Emily climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, Jake started the engine, the sound filling the quiet morning. They rode in silence, the wind whipping past them as the mist began to clear. It felt like they were leaving the world behind, just the two of them, heading toward an uncertain future. But for once, Jake didn't mind the uncertainty. He was used to it. What he wasn't used to was caring about someone so much. He had spent years alone, focusing only on the road and the life he had made for himself. But now, with Emily beside him, everything felt different. She was his responsibility now. He had to protect her. The ride was long, the roads winding through forests and small towns. The cabin Jake spoke of was isolated, deep in the woods, far from any town or road that led to civilization. It had been his father's place, a small wooden structure that had been passed down to him when his father died. It wasn't much, but it had been a refuge for Jake during the darkest times of his life. A place to escape when the world became too much to handle. He had been there countless times, trying to find peace, trying to forget the things he had done, the people he had left behind. But now, it wasn't just a place for him to hide. It was a place for both of them. A place where they could be safe. When they finally reached the cabin, Jake parked the bike in front of the small wooden porch. He glanced at Emily, who was looking around, taking in the surroundings. The trees were tall and thick, the ground covered in a blanket of leaves and moss. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but it would do. "This is it," Jake said. "Home for now." Emily didn't say anything, but the way she looked at the cabin told Jake everything he needed to know. She was still uncertain, still unsure if this was the right place for them. But Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the same exhaustion he felt deep down inside. For now, they just needed rest. They would figure out what to do next when they were ready. They made their way inside, the old wooden door creaking as Jake pushed it open. The inside was just as Jake remembered, Spartan but comfortable. There was a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a few old chairs around a wooden table. The air smelled like pine and wood smoke, a comforting scent that reminded him of simpler times. Jake set down his jacket and motioned for Emily to sit. "Make yourself at home," he said, his voice gentle. Emily nodded and sat down on the couch, looking around the cabin. For a moment, they both sat in silence, listening to the crackling of the fire in the hearth. It was peaceful, but the silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice soft. "What now?" she asked. Jake looked at her, his eyes steady. "Now we wait," he said. "We stay here for a while, lay low, and keep moving when the time is right." Emily nodded slowly, her gaze falling to the floor. Jake watched her for a moment before standing up. "I'm going to get some firewood," he said. "Stay here. I'll be right back." He stepped outside, leaving Emily alone in the cabin, her thoughts racing. As Jake chopped wood in the cold, his mind was a blur. He knew this was only temporary. Nothing in his life ever stayed the same for long. But for now, he had a purpose. He had someone to protect. And that, for the first time in a long time, felt like enough. The next few days passed in a quiet blur. The cabin, surrounded by towering trees and thick woods, was the perfect hideaway, isolated enough that they could stay hidden. Emily had settled into a routine, helping Jake with small tasks around the cabin. She swept the floor, kept the fire going, and began to get more comfortable in the small space. Despite the isolation, despite the fear of what might be out there, the cabin felt safe. Jake had always preferred solitude, but now, with Emily here, he found himself appreciating the stillness. It was something he hadn't felt in years. But beneath the calm, there was always the question of what came next. The threat that Emily was running from still loomed over them, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it caught up with them. He had to stay vigilant, even when Emily was beginning to trust him more. One afternoon, Jake was chopping firewood outside when he heard the crunch of tires on the gravel, previous night's rain. As he walked through the woods, he let his mind wander, trying to push away the nagging thoughts that had been consuming him. What would happen when they had to leave this place? Where would they go? He couldn't keep running forever. But for now, all he could do was focus on keeping Emily safe. He spent the next few hours in the woods, clearing his head, and when he returned to the cabin, Emily was awake, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked up as he entered, offering him a warm smile. "Morning," she said, her voice light. Jake smiled back, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Morning. You sleep okay?" Emily nodded. "Yeah, I'm getting used to this." She paused, looking down at her coffee. "I've never really had a place where I could just be," she said softly. Jake's heart twisted. He hadn't realized how much Emily had been through. She was strong, but even the strongest people needed time to heal. "I'm glad you feel that way," he said, his voice quieter now. "You deserve to feel safe." She looked up at him, her expression serious. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked, the uncertainty in her voice clear. Jake hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll make sure we're as okay as we can be." He sat down across from her, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll get through this. Together." Emily's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled a little more freely. "I believe you," she said. Jake didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He had someone to protect, someone to care for, and that was enough to keep him going. He would keep her safe, no matter what. The world could wait. For now, they had each other. The days began to blend together. The cabin, once a place of uncertainty, had now become their refuge. Emily had settled in as best as she could, helping Jake with whatever needed to be done around the cabin. Though the isolation was beginning to wear on her, there was a small part of her that found comfort in the quiet. She had spent so many years feeling like an outsider in her own life. But here, in the midst of the woods, she could almost believe that things could be different. Jake, too, had found a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been missing. The solitude that once felt suffocating now felt comforting, especially with Emily by his side. But despite the calm, the unease lingered in the back of his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, that their peaceful life was about to be interrupted. The knock on the door that evening was enough to confirm his suspicions. Jake was sitting at the small table, nursing a cup of coffee when the sound broke the silence. His body tensed immediately, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that was kept by the door. Emily, sitting on the couch, looked up at the sudden sound, her expression one of immediate concern. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with a nervous energy. Jake didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure who it could be, but his instincts told him it wasn't good. He walked cautiously to the door, peeking through the small crack in the curtains. The figure standing outside was familiar, too familiar. It was a man Jake knew from his past, a man from the Hells Angels chapter he had left behind. His name was Steele, and he was one of the few people from his old life that Jake still had any contact with. But that contact wasn't a good thing. Steele had always been trouble, a reminder of everything Jake had tried to escape. Jake had no intention of letting him into the cabin, but he knew he couldn't just ignore him either. He turned to Emily, his face hardening. "Stay here. he said, his voice low. Emily opened her mouth to protest, but Jake gave her a look that silenced her. He knew that if Steele was here, it was because someone had found out about Emily, and that meant danger. He stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he walked toward the door. Steele was standing there, arms crossed, his face a mask of impatience. "Jake," he said, his voice gruff, but there was an edge to it that Jake didn't like. "We need to talk." Jake didn't answer right away. He kept his distance, his body tense, ready for anything. "What do you want, Steele?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with warning. Steele eyed him for a moment, then glanced over his shoulder, as if checking to see if anyone else was watching. "It's not just about you anymore," Steele said, his tone dropping lower. "There's someone else involved. Someone you're hiding." Jake's stomach tightened. He knew exactly what Steele was talking about. "You've got no business here," Jake said, his voice growing colder. "This is over. You need to leave." Steele's gaze hardened, and Jake could see the flicker of anger in his eyes. "You think you can just walk away from this life?" Steele asked, stepping closer. "You think they'll just forget about you? About her?" He nodded toward the cabin, his eyes narrowing. "We don't forget, Jake. And neither does anyone else." Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, his fingers flexing around the rifle's stock. "You don't know anything about her," Jake said through gritted teeth. "She's not involved in this." Steele chuckled, but there was no humor in the sound. "Oh, but she is now, Jake. Whether you like it or not. And when they find out where she's been hiding, they'll come for her. And you." Jake's entire body went still. He knew exactly what Steele was talking about. The people Emily had been running from weren't just going to stop because they were hiding in the woods. They would come looking, and when they did, there would be no place to hide. Jake had always known that one day his past would catch up with him, but he had hoped, for just a little longer, that it wouldn't. He had hoped that he could protect Emily from it. But now, it seemed like that hope was slipping away. "I won't let that happen," Jake said, his voice low but resolute. Steele didn't back down. "You don't have a choice, Jake," he said, his voice hard. "They'll find you. They always do." There was a long pause, the air between them thick with tension. Jake felt the weight of every choice he had ever made, every mistake, every betrayal. And now, it was all crashing down on him. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't run from it anymore. "Leave," Jake said finally, his voice cold and unwavering. "I'm not going back. And neither is she." Steele gave him one last, hard look, then turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the gravel. Jake stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the woods. His heart was pounding in his chest, his thoughts racing. He turned back toward the cabin, where Emily was waiting, and he knew that their time here was running out. He didn't know how much longer they had before things came to a head. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. He would protect her, no matter what it took. The next few days were tense, though Jake did his best to keep things calm for Emily. They spent their time inside the cabin, doing what they could to make their hiding place feel a little more like home. The small kitchen was filled with the smell of fresh coffee and the crackling of the fireplace. Emily had started to help him cook, though she was still learning how to manage in the small space. She was a quick learner, her determination never wavering, even as the unease of their situation hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Jake had done his best to reassure her, but deep down, he knew that their time in the cabin was running out. Steele's visit had left him on edge, and though he had told Emily not to worry, the weight of the situation was starting to get to him. He couldn't ignore it anymore. They needed to leave. They couldn't stay in one place for too long, especially not after Steele had warned him about what was coming. The people Emily had been running from weren't going to stop. They never did. Jake knew he couldn't keep her safe forever, not in this cabin, not in this life. One evening, as the sun began to set and the cabin was bathed in a golden light, Jake knew it was time. He couldn't keep hiding. He had to find a way to get Emily out of here, away from the danger that was creeping closer. He had no plan, no idea where to go, but he knew they couldn't stay. Jake stood in front of the window, his back turned to Emily as she sat at the table, reading one of the old books he had found in the cabin. The wind had started to pick up, a chill creeping into the air. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always been a lone wolf, someone who took care of things on his own, but now he had someone else to think about, someone who depended on him. "Emily," Jake said, his voice low but firm. She looked up from her book, her eyes meeting his. We need to leave. It's not safe here anymore. Emily's face softened, but there was a flicker of fear in her eyes. Where will we go? She asked, her voice quiet. Jake didn't have an answer, but he knew they had to get moving. I don't know, he said, but we'll figure it out. Emily stood up, walking over to him. I trust you, Jake, she said, her voice steady but filled with a quiet uncertainty. I just don't want to be alone anymore. The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He had always kept people at a distance, always avoided getting close, but with Emily, it was different. She needed him, and for the first time in his life, Jake realized he needed her too. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch reassuring. You're not alone, he said, his voice soft. I won't let anything happen to you. Emily nodded, and for a moment, they just stood there, the silence between them heavy but comforting. Jake knew this was just the beginning, that their journey ahead would be anything but easy. But he was ready. He would do whatever it took to keep Emily safe. As the night wore on, Jake packed what little they had, preparing to leave the cabin behind. He didn't know where they would go, but he knew they couldn't stay here. Not anymore. They had to move. Emily helped him, though she was still unsure about what was coming next. Jake could see the uncertainty in her eyes, but she didn't hesitate. She trusted him, and that trust was something he couldn't take lightly. The sound of the bike starting up broke the silence of the night. The engine roared to life, the familiar hum filling the air. Emily climbed onto the bike behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding on tightly. As they drove off into the night, the cabin disappearing behind them, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of resolve. The road ahead was uncertain, and the danger was still out there, but he wasn't going to let that stop him. He wasn't going to let anything happen to Emily. The world might be a dangerous place, but as long as they were together, Jake knew they could face anything. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was doing something right. He had a purpose. He had someone to protect. The ride was long, and the silence between them was heavy. Jake felt the wind against his face, the roar of the engine beneath him, but there was still an unsettling quiet in his chest. He knew they had to keep moving, but where would they go? The road stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into the fog, and for a moment, Jake wished he had a clear answer, a place they could run to where they would be safe. But that wasn't how things worked for people like them. People who were always running, always looking over their shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Emily's arms were wrapped around him tightly, her body pressed against his back, but Jake could feel the tension in her. He could tell she was just as unsure as he was. She had trusted him, and he had promised her safety. But he knew that promise was getting harder to keep. Where are we going? Emily asked softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady himself before answering. I don't know yet, he admitted. But we'll figure it out. He could hear the uncertainty in his own voice, and it made him feel even more like he was letting her down. They were out there, alone in the world, with no clear plan, no clear path. And yet, he couldn't bring himself to turn back. He had to keep going. For her. Emily didn't say anything at first, but Jake could feel her stiffen slightly against him. She wasn't mad. She wasn't angry. She was scared. And that was the one thing he couldn't let her be. He couldn't let her feel alone in this. He couldn't let her feel like there was no one looking out for her. We'll be okay, he said, his voice more certain now. I won't let anything happen to you. Emily shifted slightly, her voice barely audible over the wind. You don't have to keep saying that, she said softly. I know you're trying. I just don't know how long we can keep running like this. Jake glanced back, catching her eyes for a brief moment before focusing on the road ahead. He wanted to say something to reassure her, to tell her that everything was going to be fine, but he knew better. He couldn't promise her that. The world wasn't that simple. But he could promise her one thing. He could promise that he would never stop trying to protect her, even if it meant running forever. They rode for miles, the landscape around them shifting from dense woods to wide open fields. The world outside the protective bubble of the cabin felt so much bigger, so much more dangerous. Jake's thoughts kept returning to Steele's warning, the mention of people looking for them. He wasn't sure who they were, but he knew enough to be terrified. And the more they traveled, the more he realized that they couldn't just keep moving forever. They needed a plan. They needed somewhere to hide, somewhere to stay off the radar. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when Jake spotted a small town in the distance. It was nothing more than a few scattered buildings, a gas station, and a couple of houses. But it was the kind of place that wouldn't ask too many questions. It was quiet, out of the way, and it might be the perfect place for them to lay low for a while. Jake slowed the bike as they approached, glancing at Emily to see if she was okay. She had her head tilted slightly to the side, looking at the town with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "What do you think?" Jake asked, his voice low. Emily didn't answer right away. She just looked at the town, her brow furrowed in thought. Finally, she nodded. "I think we should stop," she said quietly. "At least for a little while." Jake felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. They pulled into the gas station, the tires crunching on the gravel as Jake parked the bike. He helped Emily off, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that made Jake uneasy, but it was also the kind of quiet that felt like a safe haven for a moment. They walked inside the small store to pay for gas, the air smelling faintly of old coffee and the musky scent of the building. The man behind the counter barely looked up as they entered, his eyes glazed over with boredom. "Fill it up?" he asked, his voice flat. Jake nodded, handing him a few bills. "Yeah," he replied, trying to keep his voice casual. The man took the money and turned to fill the tank, not paying them any further attention. Emily stood quietly beside Jake, her eyes flicking around the store, taking in the details. She seemed on edge, her posture tense as she scanned the small room. Jake could feel the same unease growing in his chest. They couldn't afford to be noticed, not now. Not ever again. After a few moments, Jake grabbed the gas nozzle and filled the bike. The man behind the counter went back to his quiet, mindless tasks, and the tension in Jake's shoulders loosened slightly. They were invisible, for now. But how long would that last? The more Jake thought about it, the more he realized that they couldn't stay here long. They couldn't stay anywhere too long. They had to keep moving, keep changing locations. They couldn't let their guard down. Not for a second. They couldn't afford to. The bike was filled, and Jake and Emily made their way out of the store. The sun had almost set, and the town was beginning to feel even quieter. "Let's get some rest," Jake said, looking at Emily as he started the bike again. She nodded, though her eyes were still distant. The road ahead was uncertain, and the weight of their situation was pressing down on both of them. But for now, they had each other. And that was something Jake wasn't willing to let go of. The road stretched on into the night, the darkness swallowing them whole as Jake navigated through the winding highways. Emily clung to him, her arms tight around his waist, but Jake could feel the tension in her body. She was still adjusting, still trying to find some semblance of normalcy in their chaotic lives. The engine of the bike hummed steadily, the rhythmic sound almost soothing against the weight of their thoughts. Jake glanced over at Emily, who had her face pressed against his back, her eyes staring blankly ahead. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low, though the wind threatened to drown it out. She didn't answer at first, but Jake could feel her nod slowly against his back. "Yeah," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I'm fine." But Jake knew her too well to buy the reassurance in her voice. He had seen the fear in her eyes, the way she flinched every time they had to stop, the way she jumped at every noise. She was scared, and Jake couldn't blame her. He was scared too. They hadn't talked about what happened, about what they were running from. But Jake knew it was only a matter of time before the past caught up with them. "We're almost there," Jake said, trying to sound reassuring, though the uncertainty hung in his words. He had no idea what there really was. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't keep running. Not forever. They had to find a place to settle down, somewhere they could be safe, even if it was just for a little while. The next few hours passed in silence, the only sound the wind rushing by and the occasional hum of the bike. Emily's grip on him never loosened, and Jake could feel the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He had promised her safety. He had promised he would protect her. But every mile they put between them and the cabin made that promise feel more and more fragile. They couldn't outrun the past forever. "Where do we go from here?" Emily asked finally, her voice breaking the silence. Jake didn't have an answer. He didn't know. He had been living his life on the move for so long, trying to outrun his own demons. But now, with Emily, he realized that maybe he didn't have to keep running. He could stop. He could fight for something better. But where? The question hung in the air as Jake pulled off the highway and into a small, secluded town. It was late, the streets nearly empty, and the only light came from the dim glow of streetlights casting long shadows. Jake slowed the bike, his eyes scanning the town for any signs of danger. It felt quiet. Too quiet. "This place is perfect," Emily said, her voice tentative as she took in the town. "It feels safe." Jake nodded, though the doubt still lingered in his mind. He didn't know what would happen here. He didn't know if they would be safe. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope. He pulled into a small motel parking lot, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the dark. The building was old, but it looked well-maintained. He helped Emily off the bike, and they walked toward the entrance. The motel lobby was quiet, and the man behind the counter didn't look up when they walked in. "Room for two?" Jake asked, his voice calm but steady. The man behind the counter nodded and handed Jake a key without asking for any identification. "Room 6, he said. "Stay as long as you need." Jake took the key and turned to Emily. "Let's get some rest," he said softly. Emily nodded, though her face was still pale, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She followed him to the room, her footsteps light against the worn carpet. The room was small but comfortable, with 2 beds and a simple bathroom. Jake closed the door behind them, locking it and taking a quick glance around. It wasn't much, but it would do for now. Emily sat on the edge of one of the beds, her hands in her lap. She looked up at Jake, her eyes full of questions, full of things left unsaid. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake took a deep breath and sat down next to her, his hand brushing against hers. "We take it one day at a time," he said quietly. "I don't know what comes next, but we'll figure it out." Emily looked at him, searching his face as if looking for some kind of reassurance. Jake could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear. He didn't have all the answers, but he wasn't going to let her face this alone. "I won't let anything happen to you," he said, his voice steady. "We'll make it through this." Emily nodded, though Jake could still see the uncertainty in her eyes. He didn't blame her. It was hard to believe in something that felt so fragile. But Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not ever. As the night wore on, they both sat in silence, the weight of the world pressing down on them. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were on borrowed time, that the danger was still out there, waiting. But for tonight, they were safe. They were together. And that was enough. Jake finally stood up and went to the window, glancing out at the empty streets. The town was quiet, peaceful, but Jake knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. It never did. But for now, they had a chance to rest, to breathe. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to keep them going. He turned to Emily, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll be okay," he said softly, though even he wasn't sure if he believed it. Emily smiled faintly, her eyes softening as she nodded. "I hope so," she whispered. Jake walked over to the bed, sitting down next to her. The two of them sat there, side by side, as the world outside continued to turn. They didn't have a plan. They didn't have answers. But for tonight, they had each other. And that was all that mattered. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting soft shadows across the small space. Jake woke to the quiet hum of the world outside, the sound of birds chirping and the distant buzz of cars on the highway. It was early, but he had already been awake for a while, lying in bed, unable to shake the unease gnawing at him. The weight of their situation hung over him like a storm cloud. He had no clear plan, no idea of where they would go next. But for the moment, they were safe. Or so he hoped. He glanced over at Emily, still asleep on the bed. Her breathing was steady, the calmness of her face betraying none of the worry that had plagued her the night before. She had come so far since they left the cabin. She was starting to trust him, starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could be safe again. Jake stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. The small room felt claustrophobic, the walls closing in around him as his thoughts raced. He knew they couldn't stay here forever. They needed to move on, find somewhere else to hide. But where? The thought weighed heavily on him. He couldn't afford to make a wrong move. The danger was still out there, and it was only a matter of time before it found them. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to look outside. The town was quiet, the streets empty except for the occasional car passing by. It was a place that felt like it could be overlooked, but that didn't mean they were safe. He had learned long ago that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The knock at the door startled him, and he quickly moved to check the peephole. A man was standing outside, his face hidden by the brim of a cap, his posture casual but not friendly. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who it was, but his instincts told him this wasn't a friendly visit. He reached for the gun under his jacket, just in case. He wasn't about to take any chances. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Jake took a deep breath and opened the door just a crack, enough to see the man's face. Yeah. Jake's voice was low, guarded. The man's eyes flicked over Jake's shoulder, scanning the room, before returning to Jake. I'm just looking for a couple of travelers, the man said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. I've got a message for them. Jake's mind raced. This wasn't just a random passerby. The way the man spoke, the way he was looking around, it didn't feel right. What kind of message? Jake asked, his voice steady, though his hand tightened on the doorknob. The man didn't answer right away. He took a step closer to the door, his eyes narrowing. Just a friendly warning, the man said, his tone casual, but there was an edge to it. The people you're running from, they don't forget. And they don't forgive. You're not as far from trouble as you think. Jake's pulse quickened. His mind was racing, piecing things together. This wasn't just some random guy. This was someone sent by the people who were looking for Emily. Jake stepped back, his hand still on the door. Who are you? He asked, his voice low and cautious. The man didn't answer, but there was a cold smile that flickered across his face. Just passing through, he said, turning to walk away. But you'd be wise to keep moving. There. Already on your tail. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. The man walked away, disappearing into the early morning light. Jake closed the door and leaned against it, his thoughts swirling. Emily stirred behind him, sitting up slowly. Jake? What was that? She asked, her voice groggy. Jake didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The weight of the situation had just gotten heavier. He had promised Emily that he would keep her safe, but with every passing minute, it was becoming harder to keep that promise. The danger was getting closer. He had to act, and act quickly. We need to leave, Jake said, his voice low but firm. Emily's eyes widened. Leave? But where will we go? She sounded panicked now, the fear creeping back into her voice. Jake ran a hand through his hair, frustration building. I don't know yet, he admitted, though his voice remained steady. But we can't stay here. Not with that guy coming by. They're getting too close. Emily stood up, her eyes searching his face for any sign that he had a plan. Jake didn't have one. Not yet. But he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't keep running like this. They had to find a way to fight back, or they'd end up running forever. What do we do? Emily asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Jake looked at her, his mind racing. He couldn't keep her on the run forever. He had to figure out a way to stop this. To make sure they could live a life without looking over their shoulders. He glanced out the window again, his mind whirling with possibilities. We move, he said finally, his voice hardening with resolve. But not just anywhere. We need to find somewhere safe. Somewhere they can't find us. Emily didn't say anything, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes. It was the same fear he felt deep inside. They were in this together, but that didn't make it any easier. We'll figure it out, Jake said, his voice softer now. We always do. Emily nodded, though the uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. Jake knew they had to move, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The road ahead was full of unknowns, and Jake couldn't predict what would happen next. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He would do whatever it took to protect Emily. He had to. For her. For them. The next morning, Jake didn't waste any time. He had already packed up what little they had and made sure everything was in order. The small town they had been hiding in now felt more like a trap than a refuge. The man who had come by the night before had made it clear that their time was running out. He knew they couldn't stay here, but Jake still hadn't figured out where they could go next. He walked over to the window, his eyes scanning the area outside. The town was quiet, just like it had been yesterday, but Jake knew that quiet could be deceiving. The threat was still out there, waiting, and they couldn't afford to stay put for too long. Emily had been quiet since the encounter with the man. She had been packing her things in silence, her face pale, her eyes distant. Jake could tell she was still processing everything, still uncertain about the future. He didn't blame her. This whole situation had been chaotic from the start, and it wasn't getting any easier. He walked over to where Emily was sitting on the bed, her small bag packed at her feet. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Are you ready? Jake asked, his voice gentle. Emily nodded slowly, though Jake could see the hesitation in her eyes. I'm ready, she said quietly, but there was a hint of uncertainty in her voice. Jake could feel it too. He had promised her safety, but the more they moved, the more uncertain the future became. There was no safe place to run to, no guarantee they wouldn't be found. They had to keep moving, but it was wearing on both of them. Jake grabbed the keys to the bike and held them out to Emily. She took them with a small smile, but her eyes were filled with worry. Let's go, Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady. They made their way out of the motel room and back to the bike. The morning air was still crisp, and the sky was clouded with the promise of more rain. As Jake started the engine, he glanced over at Emily, who had climbed onto the bike behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist. She was holding on, but Jake could feel the weight of her fear. He couldn't blame her. He was scared too. The road ahead was unknown, and they had no idea what they would find. But they couldn't stay here. They had to keep going. The ride was long and quiet, the only sound being the hum of the engine and the rush of wind against their faces. Emily didn't speak, and Jake didn't press her to. They were both lost in their thoughts, each one of them trying to make sense of everything. Jake had spent so many years running from his past, but now, with Emily, he realized that running was no longer enough. He couldn't protect her just by staying one step ahead. He had to figure out a way to stop running, to make sure they could have a future without fear hanging over their heads. But how? Where could they go where they wouldn't be found? He didn't have the answers, and the uncertainty was eating away at him. Finally, they reached the outskirts of a small town. Jake slowed the bike as they entered, glancing around cautiously. It was the same type of place they had passed through before, quiet, isolated, with a few houses scattered here and there. It wasn't much, but it was better than being on the open road. He pulled into a small parking lot near a diner, his eyes scanning the area for any signs of trouble. What do you think? Jake asked, turning to Emily. She looked around, her eyes flicking over the buildings, her expression cautious. It seems okay, she said after a moment. At least for a little while. Jake nodded, though the doubt still lingered in his mind. They couldn't stay anywhere too long. Not now. Not after what had happened. But they needed to rest. They needed time to figure out their next move. They walked into the diner, the bell above the door chiming softly as they entered. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, and for a moment, it almost felt like things could be normal again. Jake walked up to the counter and took a seat, motioning for Emily to sit beside him. The waitress behind the counter gave them a quick smile, though there was something guarded in her eyes. What can I get you? She asked, her tone polite but distant. Jake ordered coffee and a couple of sandwiches, trying to keep things casual. He didn't want to draw attention to them, but the last thing he wanted was to stand out. They couldn't afford to be noticed. The waitress brought over their food, and Jake handed her a few bills before she walked off. Emily sat quietly across from him, her fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the table. What now? She asked, her voice low. Jake took a sip of his coffee, trying to think. We keep moving, he said finally, though even he didn't sound sure of it. We'll stay here for a day or two, then figure out our next step. Emily nodded, though Jake could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. And what if they find us? She asked quietly. Jake didn't have an answer for that. He didn't know what would happen if they were found. The fear had always been there, lurking in the back of his mind. But now, with Emily, it felt different. The stakes were higher. He wasn't just running for himself anymore. He had someone to protect. He had someone who was depending on him. And that made everything feel heavier. I don't know, Jake said softly. But we'll handle it. Whatever comes, we'll handle it together. Emily smiled faintly, though the uncertainty remained in her eyes. Jake didn't have all the answers, and he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her go. He wasn't going to stop fighting until they had a future worth living. For her, for both of them. As the sun began to rise, casting a soft glow across the horizon, Jake and Emily sat in the small, quiet diner, finishing their breakfast. The day ahead was uncertain, but for the moment, the world felt still, almost peaceful. Emily had been quieter than usual, her gaze distant as she looked out the window, her mind clearly far away. Jake didn't press her to talk. He understood. They had been through a lot in the past few days, and he knew she needed time to process everything. They both did. The threat of being found, of being dragged back into the chaos they had fled from, still hung over them like a storm cloud. But right now, in this small town, they were safe. Or so they hoped. So what now? Emily asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice was soft, but there was a hint of determination in it. Jake took a deep breath, pushing his coffee cup aside as he looked at her. We keep moving, but we need to figure out where we're going. I can't keep running forever. Emily nodded slowly, her fingers curling around the edge of her mug. I understand, she said quietly, but I don't want to keep running either. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Jake's heart tightened at the words. He knew how she felt. He had spent most of his life running, trying to escape the things that haunted him. But now, with Emily by his side, it felt different. He couldn't keep her in this state of fear and uncertainty forever. He had to find a way to protect her, to give her a life that wasn't defined by the constant need to look over their shoulders. He stood up, running a hand through his hair, trying to clear his head. I don't know what the answer is yet, but I promise you we'll figure it out, he said, his voice steady. I'll find a way. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. I trust you, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake felt the weight of her words, the trust she had placed in him. It was both a gift and a burden. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. Let's get out of here, Jake said, taking a deep breath as he turned toward the door. Emily stood up, following him as they made their way to the exit. The cool morning air hit them as they stepped outside, the world still quiet and calm. The town was small, and it felt like the kind of place where no one would notice them. But Jake knew that wouldn't last. They couldn't stay here forever. They couldn't stay anywhere for too long. The bike roared to life as Jake started it up, the engine vibrating beneath him. Emily climbed on behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist as she pressed herself against his back. For a moment, the world felt still, as if everything had paused for just a breath. But then they were moving again, the wind rushing past them as the road stretched ahead. Jake didn't have a clear destination in mind. He didn't know where they would go next. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until they were safe. The road twisted and turned, leading them through small towns and open fields. The landscape was beautiful, peaceful even, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the horizon. They couldn't outrun their past forever. As the hours passed, Emily grew quieter, her arms tightening around Jake as the world blurred by them. She didn't speak, but Jake could feel the weight of her thoughts, the fear still clinging to her. He didn't have the answers. He didn't have a plan, but he had to keep going. For her, he couldn't let her down. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon when they reached another town, smaller than the last, tucked away in a valley surrounded by trees. It was quiet, peaceful, but Jake could feel the unease in the pit of his stomach. They couldn't stay here either, but for now, they needed to rest. He slowed the bike and turned into a small parking lot in front of a modest hotel. The neon sign flickered faintly in the dusk. Emily didn't say anything as they parked, but Jake could feel her hesitation. He didn't blame her. They had moved from place to place for so long, always searching for somewhere to hide, but never really finding safety. Let's just get some rest, Jake said, his voice soft. We'll figure it out tomorrow. Emily nodded, though her eyes still held that same doubt. The doubt that he had seen in her since they left the cabin. The doubt that he had seen in himself. They walked into the hotel lobby, and the man behind the counter gave them a quick nod, barely looking up from his paperwork. Jake didn't say much, just paid for the room and took the key. The quietness of the place felt different from the other motels they had stayed in. It wasn't as isolating, but it still felt like they were living in a shadow. They made their way to the room, and Jake closed the door behind them, locking it with a soft click. The room was small but comfortable, with a bed that looked inviting after a long day of riding. Emily walked over to the bed, sitting down with a tired sigh. Jake set down his jacket and walked over to the window, looking out at the darkened street below. What if they find us? Emily asked softly from behind him. Jake didn't turn around immediately. He knew what she was asking. I don't know, he said, his voice low. But we'll be ready for it. We'll fight if we have to. Emily didn't say anything, but Jake could feel her gaze on him. He turned to face her, his eyes steady. I'm not going to let them take you, he said, his voice firm. Emily looked up at him, her eyes softening. I know, she whispered. Jake crossed the room and sat down next to her on the bed. They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of their situation pressing down on both of them. But for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't have the answers. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew they weren't alone in this. And for now, that was enough.